Good evening. Welcome to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I'm delighted to have a program that we're doing in conjunction with our colleagues at Fordham Law School, at Union Theological Seminary, and with the Peace Islands Institute. And I want to welcome, for a few words, first, the director, the New York director of the Peace Islands Institute, my friend Emre Selek. That means you get up and sit.
I want to do that sitting down, which is a great Australian tradition. We do everything sitting down. Thank you, everyone.
Stay close to me so you get picked up on the mic.
Okay, everyone, and on the internet. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bert. Of course, JTS, we have a warm relationship. We always look for opportunities to bring together our diverse communities here in New York. So we appreciate their support. Of course, we thank our guest Ori for slogging it all this way from DC to New York. For those that are online, by all means, check out the book on Amazon. I think it's a very critical topic, particularly Gülen as someone who advocates dialogue between all communities, but in particular between Jews and Muslims. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bert.
Thank you. I especially want to thank Emre for doing what was for me a mitzvah. It was a positive commandment to respect my elders. And in 2019, in October of 2019, Emre came and picked me up here at JTS, and we drove down into rural Pennsylvania, where I had the opportunity to meet Fethullah Gülen. And it was really a remarkable thing. Emre had warned me, and when we got there, we were told that the Imam was not feeling well, and being that he was under the weather, he might be able to spend 5 minutes with us. And I thought, all right, 5 minutes is 5 minutes. You know, you'd be grateful for what you get. He's a great man, and I don't want to make him sick. But I walked in, and he was sitting in something like a really large chair, one of these, almost like a throne. And when I walked in, he said, "Rabbi," and stood up. So I went over to greet him, and he said, "You will sit here in my chair." And I thought to myself, this is to me the most gracious example of what we Jews would call hachnasat orchim, welcoming guests. And I learned from that experience. As it happened, Gülen was in a robe, and he looked like he was under the weather, but we managed to chat for a full hour. And it really was one of the lovely experiences of my life because, as I'm sure you will hear from our speaker, there is a charisma about him. And when I say charisma, I mean it in the truest sense of the Greek charis. He has God's grace on him. And so when Emre reached out to me and said there's a new book about Gülen and would I be interested, so of course I was interested in reading the book. I can recommend it. And then he said, well, I want to do a book talk. And I said, I'd be delighted. Who wrote the book? Expecting that one of the Hizmet Turks would have written the book. And he said, Ori Soltes. And I said, Ori Soltes, I know that name. But I didn't know the name, and I should have, because he had already written a previous book about Gülen. But he had also written a great deal of art criticism and art history. And as it happens, an artist from New Jersey who I collect, a woman who is Indian by birth, Siona Benjamin. I have her art all over my walls, and he has been singing her praises in his articles and work for years. So I knew his name from her. He knew my name from her as well. So it's quite natural. Ori Soltes is a professor at Georgetown University. That's down in D.C. Yeah, it's the same George as Washington, you know. As I said, this is his second Gülen book, and my other connection to him is in a former lifetime, he was the director of the B'nai B'rith Klutznik Museum in D.C. And, just family history being what it is, my brother-in-law was a spokesperson for B'nai B'rith for many decades, so they knew each other from way back. So I'm really, really happy to welcome Ori here. And what I want to do tonight is basically listen. He'll talk for however long he decides. And then I'll kibitz for a while and pepper him with some questions. And then you in the audience can raise your hand. You'll ask a question. Don't be surprised if I repeat it. That's for the folks at home. And those of you who are at home who have questions to ask, you can type them in to the Q&A on your computer. So without further ado, Professor Soltes.
Thank you very much, Bert and Emre. It's wonderful to be back at the JTS, which I have not been in these halls for a long time. In fact, since before this tower was built. And I thought it might be of use and of interest, first to tell you how I first became aware of Fethullah Gülen and the movement that he has inspired called Hizmet, which in Turkish means service, for some of you, the few of you here who don't know that word, and then tell you a bit about him and really why I think this book is important given what is going on in Turkey right now and given what is going on in the world right now. So I met him and Hizmet sort of at the same time, almost by happenstance. I had a grad student at Georgetown. And by the way, you understand that they named that, I think, for King George. We have George Washington University across town.
Wait,
but
there was a King George?
There was, but I can't remember. He had a lot of numbers after his name. Anyway, Roman numerals. And I had a grad student who was part of a small group that had been organized by what was called the Rumi Forum, R-U-M-I. Rumi, for some of you who may not know who he was a 13th century mystic and poet who was simultaneously a very pious and intense and devoted Muslim, but also whose poetry reflects a strong sense of universality, of the idea that in a world made by a God that has produced endless diversity, there are no two people, no two trees, no two leaves, no two snowflakes alike that are identical. How could it be that there's only one correct path to that God? So it makes more sense that there would be myriad paths that are co-equal in significance, but mine is mine and yours is yours because we're different. So Rumi is one among many Sufis, many Muslim mystics who has promoted the idea of a universalistic perspective on how one relates to God. And so Rumi Forum is named for him. And they had organized an interfaith group of about 15, 18 people at Georgetown to discuss different topics. Once a month they'd meet. The Rumi Forum people would provide food. Those of you who are familiar with Turkish culture will understand that that was an inevitable part of the process, that they would provide food, far more than anyone could eat, of course. If you go to a Turkish house and you leave and there aren't leftovers, they didn't produce enough food for you, so you should never go back again. And they were talking about death, the soul, and the afterlife. So my student said, oh, I know someone who can talk about that from a Jewish perspective. So he invited me, and I came and I spoke with the group. It took 2-3 hour sessions for us to kind of get through the conversation. But the individual then in charge of Rumi Forum asked if they could do a book signing, because I had just come out with a book on Jewish, Christian, and Muslim mysticism, and a year before a book on symbols in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim art. They said, why don't we have a program with those two books? I said, that sounds great. So we did. And sometime thereafter, he said, would you ever consider doing a book about Fethullah Gülen from your perspective, mysticism or something of that sort? And I said, I don't know. Give me some time. And I spent about a year researching, reading everything I could find that Fethullah Gülen had written and everything written about him, before I was not only comfortable about him, but also comfortable in writing a book about him. Like many Americans or non-Turks who don't know much about the Hizmet movement, my source was a colleague at Georgetown who was an anti-religious, hyper-secular Turk, for whom someone like Fethullah Gülen, who is a man of piety and faith, is someone they fear is trying to turn Turkey into Iran. He could not grasp the notion of someone who could be simultaneously, like Rumi as the poet and as the mystic, intensely pious as a Muslim and open to all forms of faith and insistent upon the importance of dialogue among different faiths if the world is to become a better place. So I didn't know. By the time I had spent that year, I was very comfortable with him. And I wrote the first book that Bert mentioned called Embracing the World, and it connected him to a number of people, particularly to Rumi. But that's the point at which I said to Emre, who was by then the director of the Rumi Forum, I said, you know, now I'd like to meet him, because I didn't want to meet him while I was working on the book. I felt I could be more objective. And the meeting with him is something that was transformative. You know, you meet someone whom you've known from a distance, someone of some stature, a movie star, a politician, a sports star, and then you meet them and they prove to be so much less than what the public persona represented them as being. When I met Gülen, it was exactly the opposite. He was, from the first instant we engaged, so much more than I could have imagined based on all the reading that I had done and all the writing by then that I had done, in terms of, as Bert said, that sense of charisma, that sense of genuine humility, because believe me, I've known plenty of people who are fake, humble people in the course of my life. Oh, no, not about me, but it's all about me. He is the genuineness of his humility, his compassion, his concern for others rather than for himself, was profound. It was spine-tingling, literally. And over the years since then, because that's now almost 15 years ago, each time I've seen him, that sense of him has been reinforced. So the bromance really began at that point. And I became more involved with the Hizmet movement in terms of conferences and articles. And at one point, Emre, in fact, suggested to me, would you, maybe another book, but why don't you interview people who are involved one way or another from different angles, from different degrees, from different traditions, different ages, different intensities, with Gülen and with the Hizmet movement? That could be interesting. And I said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And I sort of slumped along slowly but surely. One of the things that makes this book different from others, because there is quite a growing library of fine work on him, I have to say, is because of all of these interviews. I interviewed about 80 people, and you know, from people who knew him from childhood to a Jain leader out on Long Island who has done stuff together with Hizmet because he's also interested in interfaith kind of work, and everyone in between. And people of a diverse range of ages, genders, ethnicities, and experience. And my interview questions were very simple. You know, how did you first meet him, or hear about him, or hear about Hizmet, or become involved in Hizmet? And what is it that you find compelling, and what is it to which you would object? And it was extraordinary to me that across 80 people on 4 continents in 4 different languages, these interviews were being conducted. I confess that the ones I did in Turkish, Emre helped me with, because my Turkish is very poor. But there were interviews in French and German and in English as well, Spanish as well, that there was such an extraordinary consistency of what they recognized and what they appreciated in him and the movement that he has inspired. So it took some time. And of course, once the interviews were done, there's the rest of the book, which is a brief biography of him and his mind and the things that he thinks about and the things that influenced him. And the editing of the interviews, because my first round, I sort of just recorded them as they were. And then my editor said, no, you really have to clean them up. You have to make them more stylistically palatable, which I did. And then we also agreed that I would cut out stuff that, people have a way of going on, and so cut out stuff that was not particularly relevant. But by that time, something else had happened, of course, in Turkey. Turkey, as you may be aware, started out, the modern state of Turkey, in 1922-23 as a democracy. That was the goal of Ataturk, the founding father of the country. And if there are two mistakes I think that Ataturk made in trying to develop Turkey as a modern secular state was, one, he confused the difference between separating church and state and wanting to be so secular that you become hostile to any expressions of religion. So a headscarf in public was just this side of illegal. You could be incarcerated for that kind of an act of expressing your sense of faith. The other is that he became overly ethnocentric, so that when Ataturk first began back in 1908 as part of a group called the Young Turks and the CUP that supported them, the political party that was trying to bring to an end the Ottoman Sultanate, the group called the Young Turks were Turkish, they were Greeks, they were Armenians, they were Jews, they were a whole range of different ethnicities and religious backgrounds with a common goal. But it shifted and he shifted so that he became extremely ethnocentric. So Kurds, about whom you have no doubt heard, were not even allowed to call themselves Kurds, they're called Mountain Turks. Much less to teach their kids Kurdish or anything about Kurdish culture and history. Those are the two errors that I think he made. Maybe there was a third, which is, one of the things that astounded the world about George Washington was that after his second term as president, he went back to the farm. People couldn't figure out why he wasn't just trying to be president for life. He obviously could have. There were no rules that he said he couldn't, and he was popular enough at that point. Ataturk didn't make that kind of a choice. He stayed on, which meant if you have a legislature, which Turkey had and has, technically, if I, Ataturk, say, I think we should do such and such, no one's going to argue. So you don't have quite the democracy you think you have until he's gone, by paradox. And then there's been a long history of ups and downs, and we arrive to the 21st century, and a man by the name of Erdogan becomes prime minister. And in fact, Gülen is an early supporter of his. They're not friends. This is constantly misreported. They're not allies. But he perceives in Erdogan someone who, like him, like Gülen, understands democracy as the system that is most compatible with Islam, and therefore someone who is going to stabilize and promote an ongoing democratic sense for the country. But whether it was always the case or whether power corrupts and so Erdogan became corrupt over time, and I can't judge that, and I'll never be able to know that, of course. No one will ever know that except Erdogan himself. At a certain point, it was very clear that he was slowly but surely trying to dismantle the democracy. And one of his key instruments to dismantle it was to direct those who would support him against Gülen and the Hizmet movement, treating them in a manner rather analogous to the way someone by the name of Adolf Hitler, who came to power in a democracy, the Weimar Republic in Germany, began to direct himself first against the key political party that opposed him, the Communist Party, and then found a more profoundly appropriate enemy for Germany in the Jews, so that the culmination of Erdogan's attempt to make himself all-powerful and to turn Turkey into an autocracy, in part with the instrumentation of attacking Hizmet repeatedly, was July 2016, when there is no doubt in my mind that he instituted what looked like a failed coup, except the thing about Turkey is every decade in the past 60, 70 years practically there's another coup. The Turks know how to do coups. One of the things you do is you do them in the middle of the night. You don't do them in the middle of rush hour. You round up the people you want to put out of power immediately. You don't leave them free to run around and re-galvanize. So clearly this was not done the way coups get done, at least in Turkey. And by the way, Mr. Erdogan was Johnny on the spot within an hour or two of the beginning of the supposed coup, already not only calling on his cell phone to all his loyal followers, but he already had a group of 144 perpetrators. The coup isn't even barely begun, and he's already got a list of the perpetrators. Forgive me if I'm not convinced that this was genuine. And I was reminded of February of 1933, when the Nazi Party burned the Reichstag and managed to blame it on the communists and the Jews. So in both cases, and by the way, my understanding is that one of the people Mr. Erdogan most admires is Adolf Hitler. One of the things that they shared in common in destroying a democracy and turning it into an autocracy was using the instrumentation of a fake event to galvanize people's animosity in a particular direction that proves to be particularly useful, in Hitler's case to him and Erdogan's case to him. So at the end of the summer of 2016, my best friend who lives out in Cleveland and is an avid reader of New Yorker magazine, very prominent, journalistic publication, whose journalists are very highly regarded, comes to me. He says, I have an article you've got to read. It's an article about Fethullah Gülen. It's very, very negative. And I know you're involved with him. Tell me what you think. And what I thought as I read the article is the smoke was coming out of my ears, out of my eyes, out of my nostrils. I mean, I was just exploding because it was very clear to me that this very top-notch journalist did not do his homework, made no effort to do any of the kind of journalistic research that a top-notch journalist is supposed to do, and that all of his information came from the Erdogan-controlled Turkish media. Erdogan could have written the article. So it was as negative as one could hope for. And of course, it referenced, as part of the culminating discussion, this failed coup that these Hizmet people had tried to bring the government down, and yet he had nobly managed to crush this failed attempt to bring his government down. And I thought, I got to finish this book because it needs to be out there. There's got to be someone who's pushing back. So I was inspired to really move the pace forward, and that brought the book out ultimately. It was, and I was very frank in my reasons for the book, both in the introduction, where I talk about this, but also what had delayed its coming out. The last thing was, by that time, there were people I'd interviewed who were worried and uncomfortable about actually having their names in the book because his tentacles, not Gülen's, Erdogan's tentacles, are extensive enough, and he has done or tried to do enough harm to enough people in enough places that people are nervous. So I said, well, why don't we use some pseudonyms? Which we did. And again, in the introduction to the interview part of the book, I make that point because I don't pull punches. I'm making the point. I want that point to be made. I want that point to be understood. So having led you down the path from how I first met and was impressed by Fethullah Gülen to why this book came out, which moved us from a positive to a negative, I want to circle back to Gülen and tell you briefly what it is about him that I find so compelling besides the words I used before, or how I understand his evolution as a thinker and as an actor, and why I think he is particularly important and that Hizmet movement is particularly important in today's world. And the more that is actually known about him and Hizmet as opposed to the false rumors that continue to be perpetrated, of course, from Turkey, the better. He was born in Eastern Turkey. He came from modest background, but not religiously speaking modest at all. On both sides of his family, he's got quite a lineage in terms of piety. And, you know, if you read biographies, often you'll say he was born in 1941. He was born actually in 1938. And that's because when he was born, and his father had the chutzpah, that's a Turkish word that means unmitigated gall, to give him a name like Fethullah, which has the word Allah, it has the word God in it. So he was not allowed to register his birth because this was contrary to the dictates of the state at that point. And it took 3 years or so until a friendly clerk allowed Fethullah Gülen to be registered as having been born, which is why you sometimes find the date as 41 instead of 38. His father was a scholar. His mother was very pious. The two of them, their lineages go back. And Gülen himself, you know, we use in religious terms the word calling, right? I'm called to do what I do. I feel something from God coming to me. We use it again and again in all of these different traditions. And clearly at an early age, he felt a calling to be religious. I mean, he was already studying the Quran at a young age. He became a hafiz, which is someone who has memorized the entire Quran. At the age of 9, 10, or 11, I wasn't there, so I've heard different numbers. It doesn't matter. It's a young age. So one of the things about him which is clear is that he's got a photographic memory. That will be important. The other thing about him, however, is a lot of people have photographic memories, so what? So I can quote to you any passage from the Quran, but I haven't really thought about what it means. But he's someone who also over the years is constantly thinking about what it means. And not limiting his understanding of the Quran to the text itself, but to how others have understood it over the centuries and across geography, what is called hadith, and the various commentaries, tafsir, and which is sort of midrash, but also his self-education, because he only went up to the end of elementary school in the formal sense, has included Plato and Einstein. It has included Ibn Arabi and Rumi and Sayyid Nursi. It's an extraordinary range that he has at his command. And this is important for the following reason. He ends up as an imam. And his first major posting was in Izmir, which is one of the larger of the Turkish cities, as you know, on the west coast. And he realized that he would give a Friday sermon, and the only ones in the congregation are elderly people. We're the youth. And this is 60s, early 70s. And those of you who are old enough to remember that era, which of course most of you are not, will recall that it was an era very much of youth in rebellion all over Europe, the United States. Well, Turkey was similar, but it was his conviction that what was happening to Turkish youth was that it had so lost its connection to its Muslim heritage that it had become deracinated, unrooted, and therefore afloat with nowhere to go. And he realized to communicate with that youth, I can't do it from the pulpit. So he started to go into coffee shops. And he'd get into conversations with kids. And the thing is, not only was his whole approach both charismatic as a speaker, but also well-informed and thoughtful, and something that captured their imaginations, but there was no question that they couldn't address to him that covered a whole range of things, and not just Islam, or not just the Quran, or not just some school of Sharia. He had this wider range, and I suspect, I wasn't there, that if he couldn't answer a question, he would say, you know what, come back tomorrow, I'll have come up with an answer, which both meant that he was continuing to spread further and further his own learning, but also it's a very good technique. You keep drawing them back, you keep drawing them back. And kids started to record his conversations, his sohbets, and after a while, all over Turkey, his words were known. That didn't make it easy for him in a Turkey which still prided itself on being a secular state and interpreted that to mean, well, not exactly anti-religious, but yeah, we're kind of anti-religious. So he did not have an easy time. The big change for Fethullah Gülen came somewhere in the 70s, early 80s, when he very clearly realized, based on all that he had thought about, all that he had read, all that he was writing, that it's not about Turkey and it's not about Muslims or this particular form of Islam. It's about all of us. If we're not all working at improving the world, then it's not going to be improved. If we're not working on it for all of us, then it won't end up improved for any of us. So he became increasingly impassioned as an advocate of interfaith dialogue, of multicultural dialogue, of international dialogue, across all range of humanity. And he began to think about, what are the essential problems that we deal with? Well, one of them is ignorance. There is so much. And the solution to ignorance is education. So he began to promote the development of schools, first across Turkey, then across all of those Turkic countries, such as Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on, and eventually out into the world. The Hizmet schools teach science, they teach math, they teach language, they teach literature, they teach art, they teach music, they teach sports. The only thing they don't teach is religion. So that the whole point of a Hizmet education is that it is not designed to push religion or some particular form of religion on its students. It's to make them better human beings, to broaden them in all directions. Second problem, of course, is poverty. And so the Hizmet movement began to initiate programs that would deal with the problem of poverty. If you look across the United States, for example, around Thanksgiving time, there are piles and piles of programs that are designed to provide a full turkey dinner delivered to the house of someone who can't get it himself. And you'll find Hizmet people, they're not the only ones, but you'll find them very much engaged in that kind of a project. And strife is the third of these three particular problems that he was identifying already in the 80s and 90s. Strife, and the solution to strife is, of course, talking together. It's coming together. It's not arguing, it's discussing, it's dialogue. And dialogues of an endless range of sorts and varieties, whether it is interfaith iftar dinners in someone's home, or a major interfaith iftar dinner in someone's community, or some other event that gets people together, such as this one, are designed to promote conversation and understanding as opposed to strife. So the Hizmet movement evolved. Gülen himself came to the United States in 1999. He has heart problems. And he came here for medical reasons, and he's never gone back. His physicians, even before Erdogan became the problem for humanity that he is, his physicians felt that the hyperness of Turkey would not be good for him. So he stays in eastern Pennsylvania. He writes, he preaches, he teaches. And the Hizmet movement has continued to expand, so that there are schools in 170 countries. One of the things that Erdogan did was shut down all of the Hizmet schools, hundreds of them, across Turkey, precisely where they are most needed, because those schools are inevitably established in communities that otherwise would not have first-rate schools at their disposal. And of course, an individual such as Erdogan prefers people to be less educated, less thoughtful, not more educated and more thoughtful. So closing down schools makes perfect sense for him. He is hurting Turkey more than he's hurting Hizmet. And Hizmet has spread and will continue to spread. It seems to me that the plan to dismantle it that has been in Erdogan's head at least since probably 2013, but reaching a culmination point in 2016, has not only failed, it's backfired. It's failed because you find, to repeat, Hizmet everywhere. And perhaps, this is what Gülen would say, perhaps this is God's plan, that Hizmet be a diaspora, that where Turkey itself is inhospitable to the very things that it most needs, that Gülen and those who are inspired by him can provide, yet they are doing things all over the planet that are benefiting others, and that has only expanded. So it has failed in that sense. Backfired because before Erdogan made a big deal about Gülen, most people hadn't heard about Gülen. More people have, and more people are interested in inquiring. So actually he's strengthened it. Let me tell you one anecdote which to me concisely summarizes what Hizmet is about and how different of its intentions fit together. And then I think I'll open things up for questions. I visited a school in Melbourne, Australia, where the 11th and 12th graders are tasked with growing organic vegetables because there's space in the schoolyard for a garden. And there are no organic vegetables available in that area. It's a suburb of Melbourne. So they sell the organic vegetables to all the neighbors, and they love it. Meanwhile, of course, by having to do the garden, they're coming to understand what it takes to raise vegetables. You know, I don't just go into the store and I buy them. The farmer is worrying about sun and rain and wind and snow and diverse kinds of insects. All of these issues with which the farmer has to be constantly in touch, being in touch with the earth and the sky in order to make it happen that you have vegetables, they come to understand. They're selling them to the neighbors, and the profit that comes from those sales gets sent to a village. The year I was there visiting the school, it was in Mali, a village which does not have easy access to clean water. So the only way they get clean water is by carrying pitchers on their shoulders about 2 miles to the river. So the students in Melbourne provided the funds so that a well could be dug in the village and piping could be installed, so they now have access to water. So they are simultaneously learning about different things that make them more appreciative of what different kinds of people do in the course of their lives. And of course, they're performing a service. They're performing Hizmet. Gülen is emphatic about the idea that it's not about talking, it's not about discussing, it's about doing. And it's about doing. Hizmet to him doesn't just mean providing service. The adverb that's missing, because it's just a noun, is altruistically. Your actions have to be altruistic. You do what you're doing because it's the thing you should be doing to help others, not because you're expecting some return. The only return you get is the satisfaction of doing something that is good and your connection to God. And he further feels, and has taught and written and preached, that if ultimately we as a group, and he's talking about his own people, love God, and we understand that God created everything, and that God must love the creation, then we have to love everyone and not just our own group. So the idea of teaching and learning and acting altruistically and to others because you genuinely love others is at the heart of what he's about. And it could be, you could not find anything more antithetical to what Mr. Erdogan is all about. Alas, he's not the only one of that ilk today. And that's why I ended up hurrying to finish this book, so at least some people, all 4 of them, could read it and learn about this. Thank you all very much.
Ori, you've written many, many books. I think you said the current count of either you writing them or editing them as of this morning is 28.
Last I checked.
So 2 of those 28 are about Fethullah Gülen.
Yes.
What makes a Jew like you, and I'm saying a Jew like you because I happen to know that Ori comes from a family of rabbis on both sides. So what's the attraction? What's drawing your soul, your Jewish neshama, to be, and I'll use this term advisedly, a chassid, a disciple of Fethullah Gülen?
2 things, I guess. One, as I said, is the extraordinary impression personally he made on me after we met. Maybe I wouldn't have written a second book. You know, maybe I wouldn't have written as many articles or gone to as many conferences, but I found him so compelling. But part of what I find compelling, which is not the personal thing, it's the sort of what he stands for thing, is something that I've spent a lifetime believing in. So I believe in the things that he believes in, which is we come from our respective traditions, and mine is the most perfect for me, and yours is different, but yours may be the most perfect for you, and they can be equally perfect. You can have more than 100% perfection in this equation. particularly in the matter of faith, in the matter of religion, and all the things that go with it. So I see him as championing and inspiring others to champion things that I very much believe in myself, I guess.
So I want to comment on that because I am very, I wouldn't have agreed to do this program were I not also taken by Gülen personally, his own warmth and charisma, and his writing. And I find that for me, and my family roots are not Hasidic, they're anti-Hasidic. And yet I find myself drawn to discipleship. And the other person to whom I'm drawn to discipleship is another Imam, Abdullah bin Baya. So there's something in Islam and in the way Islam is in the world that appeals to our Jewish sensibility. So I'm thinking about the fact that Gülen has schools, he works in poverty, he builds hospitals. And if it reminds me of any movement in the Jewish world, it actually is a Hasidic movement, and it would be Chabad Lubavitch. So the audience here, and I can't speak for who's out there.
The 4,000 people who are
watching
out there, by the way,
online,
watching
but
on.
the audience here, I'm just guessing, is mostly Turkish, with a few Jews. Can
Right.
you,
82.4%,
Yes.
that's a quick count.
in shorthand, can you maybe distinguish between what Chabad is in your mind? I mean, you're not a follower of Chabad, yet you are a follower of Gülen.
Right.
And what is the attraction? I mean, I'm, as a Jew who is
Right.
attracted, I'm kind of interested to hear a fellow traveler
Sure.
articulate it.
Although I have worked with Chabad under similar sorts of circumstances, and I think Chabad has evolved because my experience with it earlier on was much more of a missionary movement within Judaism.
Yes.
Right? Are
Yes.
you Jewish? Right?
Yes.
So it's within Judaism, not trying to reach beyond, but within. Whereas one of the things I find distinctive about Hizmet is that there's no missionary activity involved, engaged. So I can be completely comfortable with that because I think of, again, I see myself as a non-missionary.
So precisely because they don't reach out to you, you're attracted.
They don't reach out to me in any way, shape, or form that would be to try to convince me that just have you thought maybe you might want to become Muslim? All this stuff. So that to me is a difference. But I will say that Chabad itself, right, which grows out of the earlier Hasid, one of the developments out of the earlier Hasidut, which grows ultimately out of Lurianic Kabbalah, and Luria introduces into the vocabulary of Kabbalah, or rather puts it front and center, he doesn't introduce it, the notion of Tikkun Olam, right? Fixing the world. It's your job to leave the world a better place when you die than it was when you were born. And I see that as a very similar ideology to that of the Hizmet movement. You're trying to make the world a better place. And I'm all for people who want to make the world a better place as opposed to just make my community better, or my family better, or me better.
If I may, a personal story. President Obama once told me that he liked to promote the idea of Tikkun Olam. And he said there were really two reasons. And one was very public, and the other was personal. So I said, well, what's the public one? He said, well, the public one is there's a lot of work to do, and we got to get out there and do it. And we got to get out there and do it for everyone. The world is hurting, and it needs fixing. I said, so, what's the private one? He said, it's one of the few Hebrew phrases I can pronounce easily. So Tikkun Olam is good. You mentioned, and you mentioned it just now in passing, but it features prominently in your book, and certainly features prominently in Gülen's own writing, the works of Nursi. Can you tell us a little bit more about Nursi and his thought and his influence on Gülen, and why we might also want to learn about him?
So Nursi is, they overlap, but he's about a generation earlier than Fethullah Gülen, maybe a little more than a generation earlier. And he comes at the end of the Ottoman and the beginning of the modern Turkish period, and is the pioneer of articulating very distinctly the idea that there is complete compatibility between science and religion. between reason and faith. I see those as very important concepts that he introduces into Turkish Islam in the early 20th century, at a time when it, of course, is undergoing changes, because with the loss of the Sultanate and the beginning of the Republic, in fact, Ataturk wanted him to join the government, and he didn't, cause the other thing that he emphasizes is we shouldn't be about politics. It's not about political Islam, it's about civil and social Islam. And that's part of the reason he wasn't interested in serving Ataturk's government, for which he paid a price.
Can you
Yes.
suss out politics
Yes.
and civil?
I'm going to be very precise about it, in fact,
Good.
because that too is something which has been emphatically articulated by Fethullah Gülen, and that presents him in stark contrast to Erdogan. So Erdogan's understanding of Islam, Hamas's understanding of Islam, ISIS's understanding of Islam is politically based. Faith becomes the instrument of furthering a political agenda, or the mask for furthering a political agenda, where the agenda is really political. Erdogan will play in public so as to present himself as Mr. Pious. Well, that's actually anti-Islamic. That's tertiary shirk is what it would be called, because this is not what you should be doing.
Can you explain shirk to people?
Shirk is just, well, there's a whole series of different things that constitute shirk, but that's one of them, which is to misuse faith and to transform something which is a matter of yourself into a public display, which is objectionable. And Erdogan has done that frequently. Gülen has never had, I'll repeat it, has never had anything resembling political ambitions for himself or for Islam. This is why he could transform from being Turcocentric to being universalist without being less Turkish. Because it's not just about, all right, we want to make Turkey into a great country, MAGA, right? We want to make Turkey great again. It is about improving the world. Did I say something? So that sense, I will tell you a story. I asked Fethullah Gülen 2 times ago. It occurred to me to ask him, it had never occurred to me before, why do you think Erdogan has it in for you? Because I had my own view, and my view, and then I'll tell you what Gülen specifically told me. My view is that it's like, for those who are familiar with fairy tales, the story of Snow White, who has a wicked stepmother, who every morning looks in the mirror and asks the mirror who is the fairest of them all, and the mirror says, why, you are. And then one morning the mirror says, Snow White. And it drives her crazy. She's got to kill this girl because I'm the fairest. I have this sense of Erdogan, either metaphorically or perhaps literally, looking in the mirror every morning and asking the mirror, who is the most pious Muslim of them all, expecting the mirror to say, oh, you are Recep, and instead the mirror says, Gülen, and it drives him crazy. So there's something, I think, about the purity and the reality of Gülen and his piety that has to drive someone like Erdogan crazy, because, come on, he's got to know in his gut how false his piety is. So Gülen's answer to the question was very specific. He said, well, you know, way back when we were still in contact, he was going to some meeting, some political meeting, that from my connections I understood was not going to be good for him. So I called him up. I said, Recep, you shouldn't go to this meeting. It's going to be dangerous for you politically. And Gülen said, he fears that someday I'm going to reveal, because he wouldn't even tell me what the contents, what the details were. He said, he fears that one day I will reveal that conversation and what it was that I saved him from doing, and as long as I'm still on this planet, he has that fear. And I responded to Gülen, I said, you know, I think you're right, because he cannot imagine someone who isn't like himself. He cannot imagine that you would not take advantage of this opportunity to undercut him, because in your shoes, that's of course what he would do. So that's not just political and civil, that's just different personal just personal understandings of what it means to be a Muslim, right? One who submits to God's will.
And the difference between political and civil.
Right.
Very much so. So this will be my last question, and then I want to open it up to those of you in the room and to those of you online. Again, if you're online, you can type into the Q&A box. I want to give you a hypothetical. Let's say there were a magazine. Let's just, for the sake of imagination, let's call it The Fountain.
Sure.
Okay? And you were invited to write a short article for The Fountain.
Yes.
In which you laid out the 3 to 5 things that everybody needs to know about Fethullah Gülen. What would they be?
Wow. Okay. One, the absolute compatibility for him and those whom he inspires of being dyed-in-the-wool Muslims and Universalists who recognize no difference in addressing God between one group and another. In fact, Gülen at one point said, atheists who are doing good works, they're also doing God's work, they just don't know it. So his all-encompassing doesn't just mean different people of faith, he includes people who don't have faith, but yet who are engaged in good things. So I would say that. I would say, on a personal level, his profound humility, his charisma, his compassion, his concern for others. When I was first involved, it was still being called the Gülen movement. And I remember one of my first comments at the very first conference that I attended was, no, this is not good. To American ears, this sounds like a cult. And one of my Turkish colleagues said, well, he hates it when people call it Gülen movement, because the last thing he wants is spotlight on me. He wants spotlight on everyone but him. So that's genuine. And his insistence on altruistic action that is precipitated by and inspired by thinking and by words, but that leads to that kind of action. I think I'd say that as well.
Okay. That would be a good article in this imaginary magazine called The Fountain. So I'm welcoming any of you. Raise your hand, I'll call on you. And I will repeat your question just so that people online can also hear it. Yes, sir. Please stand up and shout it out.
I live in Bronx. So the question is from someone inside the box, and maybe you're someone outside. So there's 3 views that maybe former Hizmet movement participant might have. One is, like everything was wrong. It was and then like these might be like in the past who were in the movement, but now maybe far away. And the second one would be there was some good things, but there was also some power corruption. So there might also have been some bad things. And then the third thing is everything was really good, but it was just these political things. So, like I said, someone outside the box, how would you interpret this?
So let me make sure I understand. Your question is, what about people who were formerly associated with the Hizmet movement and who have left, who have become disaffected somehow? And whether it's because some things were good, other things were, all things were bad, etc. How would Ori respond to the disaffected, someone no longer part of the movement?
Right. So we are human, and that means we're different from each other. So there are always going to be people who fall away, particularly in the diaspora. So my parents were from Turkey, and now I've grown up in the United States, and I'm just not as committed and as interested in the ideas that attracted them. My children may be, because that happens repeatedly. The grandchildren come back to where the grandparents were. But it would be unnatural if there weren't people who fell away and were disaffected, if it was 100%. In my experience with Hizmet people, I have almost universally encountered altruistic, kind, and self-effacing concern for others, including for me when I go somewhere to lecture or what have you. There were 2 exceptions in the course of dozens and dozens of people I've met. And I smiled when I met those two exceptions, these 2 people in 2 different places who were such jerks, who didn't give a damn about me, and whose thought was, what can we squeeze out of him while we've got him here? Because it proved to me that they weren't all going to the same acting school. because there are people who were not acting like so many others were. And I would add one further thing. It's easy for me to talk about, and I have again and again, about how Hizmet has a bright future. I see it in the youth conference in Houston that I attended almost a year ago. 400 college-age-ish kids, and you could feel the energy. You could feel the energy. And 10 months later, I was speaking, it had nothing to do with Hizmet. I was speaking in Rochester at a conference, and I get a text. It was one of the girls who had been there in Houston who knew that I was there at that conference and said, would you come to the Turkish Center and speak to a group of us this evening? So she was operating. She wasn't passively waiting for something to happen. She was active. By coincidence or not, a week later, a week after that conference, I was at Los Angeles, at a Hizmet conference, an international conference of which there had not been any for a couple of years, COVID and all this other stuff. 250 people, and most of the papers were about projects that Hizmet people were reporting on, that they were engaged in different parts of Africa, in Central and South America, in Asia. There was a guy from Greece. He's Greek. He's a Greek Orthodox. He's drawn to Hizmet. I don't have to tell you, the historical relationship between Greece and Turkey is not exactly a rosy one, and part of it is ethnic and part of it is religious and all. Clearly, he sees what's going on. So there is all this positive, but how could you not wonder and worry where it's going to go if you're part of this community, which is dispersed, for which at the moment there is no hope of going back to Turkey. If my father is still in Turkey and he's ill, I can't go visit him. If he dies, I can't go to his funeral. All of those everyday important emotional things from which I'm by definition cut off because of the current situation. What the hell do I want with this Hizmet stuff? So naturally that's going to be a response of some people. And I would add further that I have no doubt that in the course of time when Hizmet people were involved with the government, because Hizmet people are people. So you not only have college professors or garbage collectors, you have policemen and people in the army and people in the legislature and people in the media. How could there not be some who would be corrupt? But if one reads the media as it has come forth in the Erdogan era, post-2013-14 or so, it's all about corruption, the culmination of which is this failed coup. And you have to have strong faith not to drink just a little bit of that in and feel it somewhere in your throat, you know. In the Bible, the first king over the United Kingdom of the Israelite tribes was Saul. And he was both the right and the wrong person to be the first king. Because what the prophetic tradition was telling the Israelites at that point is, kings are not right for you. That's right for other people, not for us. We have a king, it's God. But they needed a king. How can we go fight the Philistines when we're led by priests carrying a box with some stones in it, and they're led by generals in armor? I can't criticize them for the fact that their faith wasn't perfect. And Saul himself was both the right king and the wrong king, because he's described as looking so much like a king, head and shoulders above everybody else, but what he's mainly lacking is that kind of faith in himself, and God chose him to be king, and therefore in God. So he's a paragon and a paradigm of the wrong person. So in no human situation do you have everybody perfect or everyone responding confidently and firmly regardless of the circumstances. And that's just natural, and that's part of the narrative line of Hizmet, I think. Thank you for the question.
Professor, you are just coming to me in crossroads of my 3 times in my life. First one was I came to United States 2000, before the September 11th. And now I love cheesecake more than baklava. So I think I'm transforming more universal.
Excuse me, New York style cheesecake, I presume?
Yes.
Okay, because there are other kinds that aren't really quite. Okay, it's one.
So I No. Another one is that after September 11, I came across with you and we went Firestone. We made some programs.
Yes.
You enlightened me about universalism because I was more nationalistic view, and my concept on having Jews and looking at different ways, MAGA Turks. So it changed drastically. I thank you for that, and I changed my major and start my interfaith master after that.
Wow.
Number two, you are creator of a National Museum of
Yeah.
Judaism or
Yeah.
Jewish.
Jewish culture, I guess.
Yes. It was
Klutznick
amazing.
in
what you did
Washington.
there. I think you were the
I was the
Chief-
director, yeah.
director of the curator. So I suggest everyone to visit, that you can make some empathy, and you don't have to agree with everything, but at least that universalism you can stay to. Second thing was, you were here a couple years ago, one of the synagogues, and you told why Middle East was always a mess.
Yes.
Do you remember you were here?
Yes.
I think we need those kind of speech again, but I don't know if we can keep you alive after you talk. So that was what you told me in that sense. It's happening right now.
Yes, very much so.
It's not. So in my third cross section right now here, so Fordham Law University students are also here. Let's make a case study for myself. I'm at the crossroad again, and I'm losing hope. I agree with him, but I already discovered that. Losing faith or losing movement to faith, it's parallel.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see a single person that they were altruistic.
Hmm.
And they lost faith in that movement, but they didn't lose their practicing part of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see that.
Mm-hmm.
If there is one, show me.
Mm-hmm.
I think same thing happened in Jewish people after, whatever, that happened in Germany, unfortunately. And we are going fast track. Whether Russia, Turkey, Poland, and some of the believers of God also somehow saying that's the only way.
Mm-hmm.
Based on your knowledge on Middle Eastern context that you teach me, that you're amazed by it, what would you suggest someone like me to become hopeful? Then how can be a practical instrument to make more peaceful effort in a way that we can increase the numbers?
Mm-hmm.
Those who will stay Jewish, those who will stay Christian, those who will stay atheist, but at the same time, they will be more vocal and smart about it to prevent upcoming, this is what I did.
Yes.
After you.
So something beyond cheesecake.
Something beyond cheesecake.
I think
This is what I did.
in a way you've answered the question yourself. More programs that promote this, that promote discussion and dialogue. Two stories. One, I was at an all-day conference, actually for Rumi Forum, back in late October, and one of the participants was a Muslim woman. She was actually not part of Hizmet, but I know her because we co-edited a book together. And she clearly all day was bursting with this, which was not relevant to the conference, or to this retreat discussion, but she had to bring it up. She was part of a group called Salam Shalom, of Muslim and Jewish women who periodically meet, I think, once a month for discussions, and they had canceled the
One of the
previous
founders
meeting.
is here.
Okay. Congratulations. Tebrikler, as we say. So they had canceled the meeting that was scheduled, it must have been about October 15th or something. And what I said was, no, what's going on right now in Gaza is exactly why such meetings have to be going on, because one has to continue to have the discussions that bring us together and make it easier to empathize, you used the word, a perfect word, with what's happening on the other side of the fence and not only being focused on ourselves. Second story, first week of January, I was part of a 5-day seminar for seminary students. So there were about 22 students. About 8 of them were Muslim, about 6 of them were Jewish, and the others were either Catholic or Lutheran, and they were all seminary students. And the first 4 days were about Judaism, Christianity, Islam in terms of origins, in terms of comparative mysticism, symbols, this, that, and the other thing. We saved the difficult stuff for the last day. And the last day, the two subjects that we discussed, the second was gender in these traditions, and the first was Israel-Gaza. And there were 3 of us on the faculty. There was me, there was a woman who teaches at an Ukrainian Catholic seminary in Pittsburgh, and there was a woman who teaches Islam and Near Eastern Studies at American University, which is in Washington, D.C. She wears a hijab, so a very pious Muslim woman. And the way we framed the discussion of Israel-Gaza was the woman who teaches at the Catholic seminary acted as a kind of moderator discussant and posed questions to Gulsum and me to respond to. Not easy questions with no easy answers. My point is that afterwards, 3 of the Muslim students, 2 of whom were imams, one of whom is an imam in the prisons, came up to me and said, now I understand, because they had not heard the other side, but they also understood from me that I wasn't just promoting a side, but that I understood both sides. So conversations of that sort are more important than ever. So to the extent that one can promote and be part of those conversations, and I think it's important to have a person or persons who lead these conversations, who have both some experience in interfaith conversation, but also some understanding, both of their own faith and of other people's faiths, in order to make it most effective, because just a conversation could lead nowhere and can ultimately end up in shambles on the ground, in fact. So I don't have a real answer, but that's my non-answer answer.
Yes.
Sure.
I have a question.
Yes.
Very short, very brief. In your understanding, as far as you have read all the books of Gülen,
Only the ones he wrote in the original English. I didn't read any of those that were translated into Turkish.
okay, all the books that you have read, I think that would be enough. How would he solve the problem that we face today, as you mentioned?
I think he would say the same thing I just said, right? Which is dialogue. It would be, I mean, he has written about this sort of thing again and again. And he's expressed the importance of empathy and compassion for each other. And of course, his emphasis is also on trying to diminish the political power aspect of what's happening and focusing on the spiritual, the civil, the cultural thing that's happening. I mean, I'm not outspoken. The first question I was asked at the seminar in January was, what did you think on October 7th? The first thing I thought was Bibi Netanyahu knew this was going to happen. And I went on from that in the course of the things I said to express how I thought he doesn't care about Palestinians, he also doesn't care about Israelis. Yeah. And Hamas doesn't care about Palestinians or Gazans or Israelis. So both of them are operating from a position, in my view, it's just my view, of interest in their own power and not in the kinds of things that those who care about people care about. And neither of them particularly cares about those who suffer. So, and that is the sort of thing that Fethullah Gülen has written about and would write about and would say, I think. And to the extent that he's got a much wider audience than someone like me does, he does and will promote that kind of perspective. But it's not a solution, because unless you do have an autocrat who says this is how it's going to be, there are no simple solutions where there are people.
Ori, I'm going to take the host's prerogative of asking the last question.
Sure.
And in a way, it's a corollary to what you just asked. I was at a Jewish-Muslim dialogue program with people from Al-Azhar University. and one of the leaders of Al-Azhar wanted to compliment me. And he said, "Rabbi, you are a good Muslim." And I totally understood that this was a compliment. But I'm wondering if you would have the chutzpah to speak in Gülen's voice. Ya Imam, how can I be a good Muslim?
So one has to understand, first of all, that he may have meant Muslim with a small m and not a capital M.
Okay,
So Muslim is someone who submits to God's will.
right.
So whether it's Ibrahim, Avraham, or whether it is Jesus, or whether it is Muhammad, or whether it is Abu Bakr or Ali, any of these characters who is referred to as a Muslim, small m, is so called because of their submitting to God's will. And in their cases, we have texts that reference that kind of submission in a very straightforward manner. So I think if I were Fethullah Gülen and someone asked me what that means, it means, for him, because he is very committed to a Sufi perspective that emphasizes love and that emphasizes a very broad perspective, that his view of what God would have us be, who would be, if I am to be a lover and God is my beloved, if I am to be the beloved and God is my lover, then I also have to love all that God has created. And that by the way, doesn't just mean people, it also means animals, it also means trees and flowers and stones, all of creation, and do my best to help promote the ongoing improvement of the condition of all of that. That's what I think he would say. To be a good Muslim is to be engaged in the process of trying to fulfill God's intention, who is perfect, to bring the world to perfection, which process, by God's presumed own will, requires human intervention and human partnership, as opposed to just leaving it for God. Oh, God will do it. Pray to Allah, but give water to your camel. We must be engaged in the process. I think that's what he would say.
Well, this is why action there.
Yes, that's why it's called right between thought and action.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And again, Professor Ori Soltes, you have written 2 books. I've only read one of them, but it's the one you're selling tonight.
Good.
And it's a must read. It really, I feel, not only through the interviews, and I want to say Emrah, there was originally 300 pages of Emrah's interview.
We had to cut
Ori
it down.
magically cut it down to 3 pages. But yeah, that'll be next year's lecture. But he has graciously said that you can have the opportunity to buy the book, and this is the Jewish Theological Seminary. I think we're selling it at a discount. And he will sign for you.
Sure.
So again, Professor Soltes, thank you really for
Thank you.
a
Thank
very
you.
insightful lecture.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.